believe it or not, in person for the 8th annual Scott W. Nixon Lecture. This would be our 11th, if it were not for some of the interesting things that occurred to prevent us from holding it. I'm going to leave it to you folks to read it in the New York Times. So, retroactively. Anyway, it occurred to me, what would Scott say if he knew we had held off on a lecture because of a pandemic? Probably pikers, something to that effect. I'm not sure that he would have necessarily approved. But sometimes I think Scott was a little contrary just for the fun of it. Anyway, this is a time of great celebration because we are honoring him again this year. And one of the things that we decided to do was to bring back the IGRT students. Now you're going to hear a little bit more about what that means for those of you who don't know that particular acronym or that were not familiar with that particular era. But we decided to bring them back to run through the exercises of everything we do connected to the Nixon Lecture every year. We always have a lunch for grad students where, in this case, the IGRT students came back. They're at early, some of them want to be it to be described as early mid-career, because mid-career, I think, depressed them too much. But they, as early mid-career professionals, came to that lunch and talked to grad students here about their experience here, all of them having gotten their PhDs at URI. And they also talked about what they've learned out in the world. So we've had that experience. This morning we had a wonderful research breakfast in which there was discussion about research in the coastal zone going forward in a time of climate change, if that's something that you believe to be legitimate. I never want to jump to conclusions on that issue. The other thing is that we've had a couple of dinners, so people have had an opportunity to talk with their mouth full. And we also now are moving forward with this terrific lecture today by 3 of the former IGRT students, and it is Shaping Our Future, Ensuring Sustainable Life in the Coastal Zone. I want to thank the people who have made this possible, and if I forget anyone, please forgive me and I'll give you a good gift. Amber Neville, Jackie Wittersheim, who is new with the Coastal Institute. Jackie, wave at everybody so they know who you are. Candace Oviatt, Q Kellogg, Nate Vinataro, the Inner Space Center geniuses. They're up in the booth in the back. Those guys are fantastic. If you're ever holding an event here at GSO or anywhere at URI and you really need assistance with audiovisual, with live streaming, with anything of that sort, and hello, by the way, to the virtual audience out there that's watching this as well, they are the group to go to. They're absolutely fantastic. And I say this as somebody who worked in the professional theater for decades. Also, we want to thank Bob Sand, who came back from retirement to assist, as well as, of course, the former IGRT students. And someone I really want to thank enormously is the former director of the Coastal Institute, Peter August, who is going to attempt to control his really exciting and I would say multidimensional sense of humor in order to come up here and to introduce the speakers as well as to moderate the Q&A that will follow their 3 sequential talks. Peter?
I think Judith just said I have to behave, so I'll do my best. I was the first Coastal Institute director from 2000 to 2009. The IGRT project happened in the middle of that, and Judith reminded me just before we sat down this afternoon that when we had our official brain dump pass the baton meeting from me to Judith and taking over the Coastal Institute, She swore I spoke for 20 minutes and did not use one complete word. It was 20 minutes of pure acronyms. Since I do pretty well in acronyms, I thought it would be good if I define a few that you'll hear a lot about today. IGERT. IGERT is a National Science Foundation program. It occurs now under a new name. It's an acronym that stands for Integrative Graduate Education Research Traineeship. Acronyms are okay, but nested acronyms are even better, so we called our program the CIP, C-I-I-P, the Coastal Institute IGERT program. So you'll be hearing both of those as the day goes on. The IGERT program goal was to provide opportunity to universities. 15 to 20 universities across the country would get these awards to try new, creative, innovative things to develop a new cadre of PhD students who could work in multidisciplinary settings to deal with the complex issues that the world faced. And the IGERT program supported projects in public health and engineering, computer science, and we were the first IGERT program in coastal ecosystems. We had a couple of kind of core themes in our program. The first was your disciplinary expertise. What traditional PhD programs teach you was critical. That was your ticket to be at the decision-making table. But once you got there, you had to be able to interact, to communicate, and collaborate with people from other disciplines. And that's what our program strived to teach our students. We trained 23 PhD students from 11 departments. Our program ran from 2005 to 2011, and we had a budget of $3 million. The faculty who either served as mentors or delivered the program, 27 faculty from 3 or 4 colleges, they were all over the place. So today we brought in, invited 3 of our IGERT alumni who have followed very different career paths to share with us their views on what the big pressing issues were in coastal ecosystem science. And we thought it would be interesting to choose students who have gone down different paths because they're going to have very different lenses of bias with which to understand what's happening around us and what the solutions are. I'm going to ask that we hold all questions until the end of the 3 presentations. I look forward to a very spirited discussion with all of you here who are in attendance and all of you who are following the lecture remotely. You can chat or with your remote connection software, get a connection in, and we'll entertain those as well. Our first speaker is Dr. Erica Lentz. Erica is a coastal geologist. She works with the United States Geological Survey in their Woods Hole office. Erica, thank you.
Lens of bias is something that Pete just touched on, and as Britta and Rob and I were talking about what we were going to be highlighting today, it was something that we realized we had talked about a lot in IGERT, and is something that we wanted to remind you of, as you're listening to these overviews today. We come from 3 very different trajectories, but we are also people that have been shaped by our very different experiences. And so I'll be noting some areas of bias in my talk, and I think Rob and Britta will be doing the same. So with all of that said, as Pete said, I work for USGS. I'm a coastal geologist in the program, and we're really looking at USGS. We have 3 coastal and marine science centers. one in Santa Cruz, California, one in Woods Hole, and one in St. Petersburg, Florida. And we really brought that effort together to look at coastal change hazards as a whole and future hazards. We've identified a lot of research complexities in this field, as well as innovations that are really exciting to tackle together. So it's a pleasure to be here. A little bit about my journey post-IGERT, for those that are curious. I did get my PhD in Earth Sciences over on the main campus in the geology department. My research was studying barrier island change and evolution, both due to short-term impacts from storms, as well as longer-term decadal scale evolution at Fire Island National Seashore. I then moved on to a postdoc with USGS, where I definitely broadened my spatial and temporal perspective, looking at more regional change and future sea level rise impacts to the coastal landscape. And now I'm working with USGS, as I said before, in the Coastal Change Hazards Program. A theme across this is that, I've been very lucky to work with the decision makers, often at the start of my research, and really learn deeply what decision problems they're facing. That's a theme that attracted me to IGERT and was one that I was really glad to be able to carry through in my career. Communication is important. Those are skills we've honed, and I continue to enjoy communicating in a variety of different forms. Some of the most fantastic colleagues, I think, in the world, and those are a few of us there. But something to also bear in mind, of course, is who is missing. These pictures, as I was putting them together, struck me. So I'll let you take a look yourself at how those people that I've interacted with, very obviously visually and sometimes not, have shaped my experience. Someone who also missing. So I want to also acknowledge that because that's an important part of the journey. It's something we talked a lot about in the IGERT program, and it certainly very much shaped who I am and how I approach both my own real-world problems and scientific approaches. So this coastal change hazards focus, we're really looking at building a program-wide capacity to develop and provide these science-based products to both address the hazards and the resiliency sides of things. Three important pieces of this: the science has to be accessible, useful, and nationwide. So those are all, kind of the skills at which we're working. There's a fundamental research component that's always been true for our coastal hazards program, and something that, is fundamental to what we do. There are the products that we develop and build to serve the public. And the third leg of the stool that we're really, I feel like, doing a much better job of considering are who our users are, what their unique needs are, and how to better reach them. And we'll get into that in a moment. Because really our mission is to develop and apply, I'm going to read it because I do feel a swell of pride every time I read this mission, is to develop and apply hazard science to help protect the safety, security, and economic well-being of the nation. We say that we are policy relevant, but policy neutral. So again, there's that lens of bias piece. A few key points. Sea level rise, we know, is going to be something that we haven't faced before. 2 to 4.5 feet is estimated by 2100 as the more likely case, but it could be much higher under worst case scenarios. This is all something that is going to be new to us as a modern civilization. We just haven't faced these rates before. We know the coastal landscape varies. We see it all around us, and so does the response to the climate drivers that are driving this change. And the drivers themselves vary as well. It's an added complexity. Our adaptation will require a variety of these approaches to management. And again, this is where the user piece comes in. If we can work with the users at the outset, we can develop and refine products to really meet their needs and understand them more deeply. Finally, Uncertainty doesn't mean we can't act. So first, sea level rise. I think it's probably not a surprise to this audience, but all the same, the future will not look like our recent past. We've enjoyed a relatively steady sea level rise rate over the last 2,000 years or so. That's going to change pretty dramatically. This is the more recent NOAA report that came out in February with the updated projections and scenarios that are going to inform the National Climate Assessment, the 5th version. And really, that report found that there's a lot of convergence around projections that are looking at a century's worth of sea level rise in the next 30 years. So that's the equivalent of a foot by 2050. In addition to sea level rise and this kind of longer term climate scale trend, there are other factors to consider. There's this weather scale variability, waves, water levels, storm events, tides, seasonal cycles, etc. This also affects the drivers of change that we see along the coast. So there's a lot to account for already. And then when we look at the impact to the coast itself, we've got that variable coastal landscape piece. These driving forces act on it. There are all kinds of physical and biological processes that are affected. There's groundwater impacts, wetland loss, flooding, coastal erosion. We've got these very different environments, from estuarine systems to marshes to heavily developed shorelines, sediment supply issues among those. And then there are these potential impacts. There's habitat loss, there's public safety that are the consequence. Management decisions that then get made that help to shape what the coast looks like, in some cases reconfigure it, which can also affect the baseline that the driving forces are acting on. And so the cycle continues. So there's a lot of uncertainty when we're looking at coastal change and coastal impacts. And yet we can't sit on our hands and do nothing, because decisions are getting made now, both in the short term and the long term, whether or not the science is available. And given our mandate, we really need to make this information more accessible to the people that need it. One approach that we've taken is working with users at the outset. This was the theme of my postdoc, where I got to work before any research had been conducted with 8 resource managers from across the Northeast through a structured decision-making process. It was a week-long process where we were sequestered in a room, similar to some of our IGERT experiences, actually. And I worked very directly with the decision makers to better understand, to deeply understand what the problem was that they were facing, what their objectives were, which were to sustain services and infrastructure, but also ensure the persistence of habitats and iconic landscapes. And really what we centered on was the science needed to show them better what land was simply going to be lost and what might be available, even if it was in a different form or somehow altered or changed. Okay, but decision making is a very iterative process, and it really allowed me to know firsthand how this information was going to be applied so it could be seamlessly ingested into parallel habitat models that were also being developed at the time. So how do we approach this problem now that we've identified it? What do we do research-wise? So we've heard from the users. We have some data, and we know things. We know some things well. We know some things less well. But we combine that information. In this case, we've been, I call it embracing uncertainty, but really using a probabilistic framework, probabilistic approach to combine this information and this knowledge to give us a better sense of what the coastal impacts outcomes might be. So you can see some schematic bar plots associated with those. And those then translate pretty well to risk in some of these risk applications that decision makers are looking and in many cases employing already. Risk-based framing was something that the 4th NCA used, for those of you that might have read it. both what is most likely to happen, as well as how bad could things get, the worst case scenarios. Once you have a sense for your uncertainty and a sense for how controllable these things are, this can also help to guide some of the decision approaches you might take. You might employ scenario planning, for example, or adaptive management might be a better strategy depending on what your outcomes look like. Something USGS is doing right now is looking at these hazards across our mission area. So this includes earthquakes and landscapes, landslide hazards, et cetera. And really looking at this intersection with society and trying to do better in terms of serving our risk research to our users. And again, this is this deep immersion into what the user needs, how we reach them better. Something we've also been exploring in our program is user-centered or human-centered design approaches. This is relatively new for us, but by placing users at the center of our work. I'm just going to read it again. Our scientific products and research can be more effectively guided to provide more accessible data and information to meet user needs. This is a fascinating approach. We're working with design, we're working with social scientists on this. We're conducting empathy interviews and workshops with our target audiences. We're not just producing science because we think it ticks a box. We're actually trying to understand more what the needs are and tailoring our science, our research questions to make sure that we're providing information that is applicable. So this is also informing some of our comprehensive data access and visualization products. It takes a lot of time. We have to be patient. Our leadership has to embrace this. This is all new for USGS. It's a big change for us. It's very exciting. I'm very excited, given where I came from and my experience in IGERT and what you know about my experience to date. So back to coastal change hazards and this focus. So again, that theme of defining shared goals and a common vision. We can ask these research questions, and provide that fundamental research, observe, monitor, model, and forecast. That is something that we do well in our program. We're continuing to explore how to make the information more accessible, product delivery reliable and sustained. That's very tricky in the federal government, where often funding levels do not support the continued sustainment of products once we produce them. And then fundamentally, what do people care about? We're having the courage to really ask these questions in a meaningful way and to capture this information and use it to inform how we do what we're doing. So a few summary points. Hopefully, I've made the point clearly that the coastal landscape is variable and the change response will be as well. We do know a lot about where the coast will change. And we also need to know more. I think we have a lot of convergence around 2050 and sea level rise projections, but there are future scenarios that still have a lot of uncertainty. Where and when storms will hit is a big one, and that's a timescale coupling that's really difficult. Storms versus sea level rise. Think about that trend line that I was talking about. That is, weaving that information together is challenging. Humans are a wild card in these systems, right? What we're going to do and how we're going to alter the environment is a major challenge. And we know that there are going to be major changes. But we can, hopefully, I've shown you a few brief examples of how we can use both the uncertainty that we have in these systems and our knowledge to say something a little bit more. This can inform some of the management strategies that we might adopt that allow for some flexibility moving forward. Understanding your risk tolerance can help you frame some of your decision-making approaches. And most fundamentally, the user engagement piece is key in the work that we're doing, developing products and tools to serve the nation. So that's what I have for now, and I think it's back to Pete.
Our next speaker is Dr. Rob Griffin. Rob is an environmental economist. He splits his time between the East Coast and the West Coast. When he's on the West Coast, he's at Stanford University, where he's working on the Natural Capital Project. When he's on the East Coast, he's at UMass Dartmouth and works as a research professor. Rob?
Thanks, Pete. All right, thanks, Pete, for the introduction. Thanks to the Coastal Institute for having me. This is really exciting to be here, and it's certainly an honor to be involved in the Scott Nixon lecture. Thank you all for joining us here in person and online as well. To parallel Erica's discussion, a little bit about how her career has progressed since she left URI. I graduated from the Environmental and Natural Resource Econ program on the main campus here in 2012. And started as a postdoc at Stanford then, and have continued to work there since. And then in 2019, I moved over part-time to the UMass Dartmouth as a research assistant professor there. So fewer stops. I don't have any kids yet. We'll see what happens there. So I wanted to speak to you today from my perspective as an environmental economist about how we can link together fundamental basic science, some of which has been done here and will continue to be done here at GSO, to applied ends and decision-making processes that are going to shape the future of our coastal and marine systems. And I wanted to start, given that this is the Scott Nixon lecture, and some of his work was instrumental in some of the work I'm going to present today. I want to start today with Giovanni da Verrazzano, who was the first explorer from Europe to find Narragansett Bay. And Scott used his arrival as a narrative device in his work and a benchmark against which to measure water quality changes. I've been told that he had a talk he used to give where he would start with the question, when Verrazzano arrived and was wading around in the waters, could he see his feet? And this was a sort of rhetorical device to motivate the question of what the water quality was back then. It turns out that that's almost 500 years ago now, 498 years ago that occurred, and a lot has changed since then. There's been millions of people that have moved into the watershed, that we've seen the pre-industrial age, the industrial age, the modern age have all transpired since then. And by Scott's own accounting in the 1990s, all of that had increased nitrogen loading into Narragansett Bay by a 5-fold and phosphorus loading to the bay by 3-fold. And these water quality issues spurred action in that time and thereabouts, in particular around trying to comply with the Clean Water Act and reduce the amount of impaired waterways in the Narragansett Bay watershed and the bay itself, and in particular thinking about and putting money towards improving wastewater treatment plants, so point source pollution loading into the bay. The Narragansett Bay Estuary Program has done some excellent work to summarize this in their most recent State of the Watershed report, and I recommend that you flip through the 500 pages if you have some time. The conclusions of that work and other work have suggested that those efforts to reduce point source pollution have really paid off, including a 55% reduction in nitrogen loading and 45% in phosphorus loading, with limited changes associated with non-point source pollution. So we're making some success based on these efforts, but these don't necessarily come for free. So the Narragansett Bay Commission has already, or is currently and intending to spend over $1 billion on their wastewater treatment plant upgrades. They control or operate 2 wastewater treatment plants in the watershed. There are more than 3 dozen, and all of which are also doing upgrades. And so those are not cheap. The Trust for Public Land has estimated that there's roughly $15 million in conservation of land done every year in Rhode Island, which can also have potential effects on mitigating water quality issues in the bay through nutrient uptake or sediment uptake and other processes, as well as potentially displacing sprawl and other issues. So these costs are real. This year in October is also the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which has been a really key policy in driving a lot of this change. Concerningly, researchers seem to indicate that the costs associated with all of these changes may actually be larger than the benefits that we're able to monetize or to quantify at this point. And that concern has driven an extensive effort currently to develop approaches to estimate a social cost of water pollution that's akin or commensurate to prior work that's looked at air quality and social costs associated with pollution there and greenhouse gases. And the conclusion of this work is still to be reached. It's pretty clear at this point, the consensus is that we're probably not capturing all the benefit streams adequately. And so to advance policy making, we also need to do some fundamental science on the social science side, and in addition to the natural science side. So as part of my modest contribution to this space, sorry, hopefully that mic comes back in. So I led a project funded by the Southeast New England program here in Narragansett Bay recently with collaborators from the University of Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, Mass Audubon, and colleagues at the Natural Capital Projects to look into the recent changes and their potential effects on the benefits that people receive from water quality improvements in Narragansett Bay, and also try to answer some scientific questions. As part of this process, in the early phase, before we did any science, we reached out, like in Erica's slides earlier, to try and figure out what people wanted to know. So consulting decision makers and stakeholders in the watershed and figuring out what their needs are related to the capabilities that we had for science around the value of water quality improvements. And we got a lot of different responses, some of which are summarized here. I don't want to belabor those or read through them, because I think maybe I could use an update on the Verrazano metaphor and synthesize all of this down to one key question, which is, what would Pete August be willing to pay to see his toes when he wades around in the bay? So you all may know Pete as an excellent scientist, mentor. A lesser known quality or interest of Pete's is when he goes out into the water, either when he's hanging 10 off of his surfboard or poking around in tide pools, he likes to stare at his lovely toes. And so if we could start to say something about Pete's values for this improvement in water quality, so he could toe gaze to his heart's desires, and also say something about all the other people that use the bay and their values associated with whatever ways they use the bay, then we could start to link policy outcomes to well-being outcomes and hopefully fill in some of those gaps that have been identified and try and do a more robust science and justify these policies and programs that we have in place. So in that project, to do this work, we relied on an integrated assessment framework for this, which is not that far off from what Erica showed earlier, except I guess for some reason economists think of management decisions and actions as a key driver of outcomes and not the sort of the end point, but I think she had an arrow pointing back to the beginning, so this kind of fits that story. And so these models are potentially familiar to you in your work in the sense that they are generalized as a causal systems model for simulation, where you can link an action or a decision to changes in the environment, those environmental changes to the services and goods that the environment produces that people value, and then finally measuring the change that would occur to people's well-being as a function of changes in those services. I'm not going to go into any depth here on this other than to say that, thinking back to the motivation for the iGRIP project and the training that many students received there and the faculty really stressed was this integrated research is critical, But I would argue that a step further, and this is kind of going to be the thesis statement of the rest of the talk here, is that it's not essential just to have integrated interdisciplinary research, but it's also key to link it to applied decision making at the end for the benefit of being able to affect decisions in a useful way potentially, but also as a reflection to see what we've achieved with basic and fundamental science. And which you'll see here is quite a lot, I believe, especially the work Scott did here at JSO and Candace and others. So in terms of outputs of this study, we found, not surprisingly, that those large reductions in phosphorus and nitrogen loading into the bay also generate large changes in potential value for people. So we estimated a change in roughly $50 million worth of per year for willingness to pay for the water quality upgrades that have been seen over the last 2 decades. This change is fairly meaningful. This is in the Upper Bay, is that, it's a jump in quality potentially, at least in terms of the water that's going into that area from the watershed, of ability to fish versus an ability to swim, like moving not just incrementally, but in a big jump. You might not want to drink it yet, but swimming in it would be okay. And that's on average across the Upper Bay. I'm sure we all can come up with examples of places where we wouldn't want to swim in the Upper Bay still. There also seems to be a fairly large role for dams to play, or they are currently playing in terms of maintaining watershed water quality. We simulated a potential change where these dams were moved, and this was based a large part on Art Gold's work. And it seems like based on their ability to retain sediment and nitrogen in the upper watershed, that the downstream water quality impacts, if they were all removed on an annual basis, would actually be fairly large, inducing up to $40 million a year decrease in benefits associated with water quality. We also noted that conservation efforts in the watershed may not have a lot of impact on the water quality entering the bay. This isn't necessarily news in the sense that Scott himself has written about this extensively. It's fairly well known that non-point source pollution in the Northeast isn't as big a driver for water quality issues as wastewater treatment plants are and point sources. The thing that was maybe a bit surprising to me, though, was that, at least in the simulations efforts that we employed, that even large-scale conservation efforts didn't really seem to have a very large effect on incoming water quality. That might seem very controversial, and this is where I get to the caveats of this work. So this work has all of the main caveats that you might think come with a large-scale integrated assessment model like this that links many different disciplines. It also has some very specific caveats that I'd like to mention here, one of which is that we didn't measure upstream water quality levels, and so none of this measures benefits to people from improvements in freshwater quality. It manifests through freshwater down to the inlets of the bay, but doesn't actually measure the water quality upstream, which is very important as drinking water sources for many communities and for other reasons. We also didn't measure other ecosystem services from land conservation, like recreation or timber or all the other things you might get from a forest. And finally, we also didn't measure valued commercial species in the marine systems, or charismatic species like horseshoe crabs that you might want to pick up and walk around with and have fun with. And so lots of things left out leaves room for interpretation, but I think we also got to some really interesting valued endpoints that made great use of previous work here at JSO in an applied decision-making context that also offered some insights for how social scientists do their work and what gaps we still have in terms of measuring these benefits at a national scale as well as here in Narragansett Bay. I suspect, but I know not all of you are ecology or natural scientists here, and so I want to address also another issue here is that you might be uncomfortable or disagree with the notion of commodifying or monetizing natural assets or charismatic species or or things like this. And I think it would be worthwhile to pause to reflect on the fact that we implicitly are doing this all the time, whether or not we actively say we are doing it. And so for the remainder of my few minutes that I have here today, I just want to talk about this integrated assessment modeling framework in a few other contexts and talk about how it can be used to improve decisions elsewhere. So one of the other big headline news stories that we've seen recently around trade-offs in between different marine resource users and marine resources has been the conflict between lobstering and North Atlantic right whales. North Atlantic right whales are critically endangered, and it's certainly the case that entanglement from lobstering is at least partial contributor to that stock decline that has unfortunately seemed to accelerate in recent years. The fact that we are continuing to lobster indicates that we have, as a society, already decided that we are comfortable with some level of risk to this population and are willing to trade off the production and consumption benefits that we get from lobstering. There's been some efforts to try and improve this situation that have been fairly successful, including area closure management and different lobstering approaches. I'm starting a new project coming up funded by a National Fisheries Wildlife Foundation and Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, looking at on-call fishing systems for lobster pots or ropeless gear. You may have heard of this. The margins for lobstering in Massachusetts are pretty slim. Lobstermen don't make a lot of additional money on top of the costs that it takes to conduct their fishing efforts. And so for this to be a viable solution as part of this, this issue that we're facing here, we really need to understand how this is going to affect their livelihoods through increases in cost or changes in cost potentially, as well as the catch per unit effort. And that all exists itself within a couple of natural and human systems contexts. So it's really important to use an integrated assessment modeling framework like this to measure the outcomes of potential policies in this space. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention wind energy too here. The Ocean SAMP was critical to get the first offshore wind farm here in Block Island, and there are many more coming. There are also many more lawsuits coming that have been aimed at everyone if you don't keep your head down. And these lawsuits, I hesitate to use them as a rhetorical device, but I think they're important to keep in mind in both of these contexts, in the sense that you don't want to manage by lawsuits. Having a judge decide outcomes in these marine resource spaces is suboptimal compared to having considered management, scientific and otherwise, consensus-based management making decisions. But the fact that these lawsuits are happening indicates the intensity of the value people attach to these marine resources and the ways that they use them, and also indicate that there's still some inadequacies in the management structures that don't allow for those values to be realized and reconciled amongst uses. And so people go to court about it. And so one of the solutions that's come up in this space, potentially for dealing with conflicts between wind energy and fishermen, has been a compensation structure where wind farms might compensate fishermen based on historical or current landings in an area, or the cable transit corridors. That's an ongoing process right now in front of the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council, as well as in Massachusetts. And that currently isn't enshrined in management. That is happening either de facto as agreements between different groups, and it's not clear what the standards are there. But one thing that is clear is that we know from other research that these populations, these fish populations, are not staying in the same places. They are moving, and they're moving rapidly. And so the durable asset that is a wind farm that can operate for 35 years out on the continental shelf may have different fish moving through it now or 10 years ago than they will in 20 years. And so having a policy that is based on existing economic activity and resources seems somewhat short-sighted. So I've started a project with a bunch of collaborators under the National Science Foundation's Blue Economy Convergence Accelerator program to look at how not only wind energy and not only fisheries revenues, but other valued marine resources, including birds, whales, and more, are going to change through the future, and not just measure them in biological or biogeochemical terms, but also thinking about how they manifest to valued resource outcomes in a spatially explicit way to help inform ocean planning. So I'm going to stop there. I'm hopeful that this type of thinking, if we continue to do it, pick up this mantle, work in this way, moving forward, that we'll have our future explorers, our intrepid scientists, our modern day Verrazanos, all look back and be thankful for the thoughtful stewardship that we took over our marine and coastal resources. Thank you.
That's right. That was great. Our next speaker is Dr. Britta Jessen. Britta leads interdisciplinary research and partnership programs for the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium.
Wow, it's weird to be back here. But thank you very much. I'm humbled to be part of the Scott Nixon Lecture Series. It means a lot. As Pete mentioned, I'm currently with South Carolina Sea Grant, but I thought I'd talk about this work that I've done, which extended from my graduate research here in Puerto Rico. And I thought I'd start by sharing with you this team. Well, actually, at the moment that this photograph was taken, this is not a team yet. This is a group of specialists in their field. Some of them are social scientists, some of them are resource managers, some of them are coastal ecologists, and one fantastic wizard of remote sensing and computer learning algorithms. So at this moment in 2018, as this group of people are standing on Keewaydin Island in Southwest Florida, this is the second time that they've gotten together as a group. I had asked for them to come both here in Florida and also in Puerto Rico to learn from each other about their specialties and their needs as we try and figure out how we can develop more coastal resilience in these systems following major hurricanes. I mentioned that they're a team. In my mind, this is SIP 2.0. And a direct line can be made from my experience in the IGRT program to this point of time. But actually, there's a farther connection. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention this pop-up here. This team has now formed the Mangrove Coast Collaborative. So there's a farther connection back. There are two people who unexpectedly ended up in mangroves. One of them is me, and the other was Scott Nixon, looking about 26 years old in this photograph. I don't know the exact year, when he went on a trip to Malaysia with Nelson Marshall. And to my knowledge, this is the only research trip that Scott ever took in mangroves, but it must have stayed on his mind because he sent me there some 25 years later. And when I did unexpectedly end up in mangroves, Scott gave me this letter that Nelson Marshall wrote to him and then resent to him because apparently he didn't answer the first time. So I'll read this part to you. Dear Scott, when I was working in mangroves in Malaysia and the conservation types were crying out against any loss of these natural areas, I kept asking myself, how much mangrove is enough mangrove? Of course, this is a question that applies equally to tidal marsh conservation. So in his letter, Marshall goes on to explain what he's talking about through this question, and he's talking about ecosystem services, which is not a word that's been directly used by my co-presenters today, but has certainly been something that we've been talking around. So ecosystem services are the provisions that ecosystems give to human societies, whether that's goods or services or intrinsic value. And if you haven't learned about that, Anthony et al. 2009, my friends, is a product of the IGRT group. So I had the pleasure in 2019 of working with some fantastic scientists out of Duke University, and we made this, of course, spaghetti chart up here, and just don't get too freaked out about it, other than to understand how much complexity there really is when we talk about the ecosystem services that are provided from a single mangrove ecosystem to the communities that are there. And we looked at two different versions of this model. One was a well-functioning mangrove, and one was a degraded mangrove that hopefully we would be able to restore. And so I'll scale in just a little so you can get a sense of what we talked about with the community. So these would be experts in the field and community representatives. And so they said, yeah, we value storm protection and flood reduction, and we value the nutrient reduction that comes from the sediment transport and maintenance. We value the fisheries that come out of this. That is a huge deal in Southwest Florida with all of the tourism dollars that are dependent on fisheries. So that was all in my mind, as was the letter that Scott gave me about a decade later, when I returned to Hobos Bay, which is on the south coast of Puerto Rico, 6 months after Hurricane Maria had come through. So that's the perspective that was taken from a drone shot just after the hurricane passed through. So how much is enough to protect not only the communities that live directly behind these mangroves, but of the rapidly accelerating coastal population that we've had across the world, whether they're behind mangroves or salt marshes? But recently, I think that that's not our only question, and I think that we should start adding two more important questions onto this. One thing to let you know about is that not all mangroves are adapted for hurricane areas. You've got mangroves, of course, in the equatorial zones, and those have not had storm impacts. For those that are frequently impacted by hurricanes, we have this paradigm of thought that a mangrove system will become mature in about 20 years. And that kind of fits well with the fact that a major storm generally hits an area about every 20 years. That's changing because, as we all know, with increasing temperatures, storm intensities and frequencies are increasing. So what happens if a mangrove system has not reached its new steady state and maturity before the next big storm comes in? So how persistent do we need these systems to be between storms? And another thing to consider, of course, as we talked about climate change, is the emergence of novel systems. So some of these areas, for instance, in Florida, for some species, they're at the northern range of their latitudinal expansion, and that's going to change over time. And so what are those novel ecosystems going to look like? How consistent do resource managers need to keep these systems as we have these expanding ranges? Well, let me quickly orient you in case you haven't lived this experience as I got to do. Back when Hurricane Irma directly made landfall on Marco Island here, actually it was Cape Romano, at Riverine Bay. I was the research manager there. Riverine Bay is 110,000 acres of the Western Everglades. That scale is about double the scale here of Hobos Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, where I conducted my graduate studies. 9 days after Hurricane Irma came into Southwest Florida, Hurricane Maria slammed into Puerto Rico. It was a Cat 3 for us and a Category 5 for Puerto Rico. So at the time that event happened, I was the only working member of these reserve systems that had the privilege of doing work in both of these systems. So, and I knew the important lessons that we could gain from the fact that we've had a lot of similarities and some contrasts between these two systems, and it seemed critical to me that we start doing some cross-exchange work. So here's one of the things that I knew is that there is a pattern, a trend of tipping points that get reached in mangrove ecosystems. And that generates what we call ghost forests. So this is a ghost forest here on Marco Island. And what led to it was a chronic stress, which was the fact that there was a road built back in the 1930s that restricted the hydrologic exchange into the site. And so it had this chronic stress and was probably a stunted mangrove, but still functional in some way. And then it gets whacked by a major storm. And then you start having a positive feedback loop of loss, well, negative feedback loop of loss. And so I saw this site here in Rookery Bay and said, I know that there are sites just like this in Puerto Rico. And so it was time to make sure that other people were seeing the same things that I had seen over time. So I brought the team together, and we used a method called co-production, which I'm very glad that my co-presenters had also talked about. And this is from Bayer et al. And it's a really short but important paper for those of you who are interested in learning about how do we start building projects that are iterative and involve community input and stakeholder feedbacks from the start and continuously through the project. So the first thing we had to do was get a sense of the main issues that are affecting both of these sites. So we had a number of meetings, both again with experts and also community representatives. So we brought in people who are representing marinas, people who are representing the ecotourism industries and the fishermen in the area. This is Chapa talking to me in this picture. He is the director of Puerto Rico Sea Grant, and so on and so forth. And so we ended up with, this is not even half of that big questions list that we came up with and that we were asked to start taking a swing at. So we had three advisory groups, one in each reserve, and a technical advisory group that was making sure that our science is being conducted well. And here are the 4 tasks. I have to say, we're still in the middle of this. So task 1 was to use remote sensing to map the damage that was happening in both of these areas over time. Task 2, which is happening right now, is that we've got teams on the ground who are assessing levels of stress of mangroves in the different systems that had been identified by the stakeholders. Task 3 is that diagram you saw earlier about ecosystem services. We use that and work directly with the stakeholders so that we can get a sense of their needs and the impacts to the services that they're receiving from damaged systems. And task 4, bringing it all together, is to work with the decision makers and understand from them how they're going to start incorporating both the quantitative and the qualitative data that we're bringing into them and start making these really tough decisions that are balancing trade-offs, as Rob had mentioned, and time and priorities. Those of you who were at the research breakfast this morning heard Bogdan, my peer at IGERT, who is a business professor, talk about how excited he was that I was using agile management in this. So agile management is derived from business frameworks and startup companies, and we actually brought in a team of consultants who did something called Lean Canvas with us. And Lean Canvas is designed for business startups to write out what their essential business plan is, and our consultants helped us actually use that to write what our proposal was going to look like as we were forming this collaborative. It went really well, and I recommend going this interdisciplinary route. But we worked with them as well to learn about this agile framework that companies use in order to have that adaptive management and iterative framework through these multidisciplinary teams so that we knew that each component was responding to what the other needed. And we would frequently work with our project advisory groups and we ask questions like, okay, you told us that these are your key areas. Is there anything we're missing? Should we hone in on those? And so on and so forth. And so here we are. This is another die-off site in Puerto Rico, and I wanted to briefly touch on all the different components that are necessary for the resource managers to start making their decisions given trade-offs and resources needed. And so the first ghost forest picture that I showed you is currently under restoration. And I had one point given a talk where I talked about all the different components that are necessary for that restoration to finally get off the ground after decades of trying to make it work. So we had a team of scientists that were telling us what the problem was and what the impacts were in the site. And they obviously have to continue that work as the restoration happens and we monitor changes. But we also need to perform that ecosystem services modeling and to really make sure that we had a good assessment of the impact in the stakeholders. We even did a blue carbon feasibility study, which is a whole other talk, but to start putting this into dollars and cents, as Rob had said. And of course, planning was a very big part of this process, making sure that all our ducks are aligned with permitting and planning. And this didn't really come together until two last pieces. One is that the Florida Coastal Office got renamed as the Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection. And everything kind of changed into the framework of we need to start talking about resilience in our systems. And when that happened, we found an easier lock for our key to go into and some kind of more lubricated system for us to talk about the projects that we needed to do. And that helped with funding. And the second was, to be honest, getting hit by Hurricane Irma freed up some money so that we could be able to go after this restoration. So these are all the partners that are involved in that restoration project. And a big thanks goes to NOAA for providing Hurricane Irma relief funding and for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, who are actually managing the project. So to sum this up, how are we building a path to these three persistent questions? We need to continue keeping these teams well-funded and lubricated, and we absolutely need to bring in the social science aspect as we're looking at what kind of projects we need to take on in the future. Whether or not these systems need to be persistent and we need to go in after a major storm and start doing either pre-restoration work or post-restoration work is going to involve the wisdom of the natural resource managers on the ground. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more from that community. And creative modeling for how consistent these need to be. At the time that I was leaving Florida, there was some really interesting discussion going on about species distribution modeling and about how we can start taking into account our climate models and blend them with species distribution modeling to start coming up with some new ideas for what our novel ecosystems are going to look like over time at these range shifts. So I'll go back to what Marshall was writing to Scott. He says, where did I want to start? When I think of some of the very extensive mangrove tracts that I'm familiar with, or when I drive south in the US and pass miles and miles of saltmarsh, all of which I hope can be preserved simply because I am a nature lover, I can't help but wonder, in terms of environmental needs, how much is enough? And I think that Scott was also addressing this before Nelson wrote, when he said that the debate over the value of tidal wetlands is complex and very emotional, and indeed that's quite true. But I am very proud to say that SIP keeps happening, and new teams of multidisciplinary experts keep coming together. Thank you.
I think that was great. I would invite our speakers to come up front. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. And we have time for questions from the audience. Both audiences, if you're tuning in digitally, please send any questions that you have to us via the chat function on your connection. Dr. Nate Vinatero is monitoring that. Jackie with the microphone will promptly hunt you down when you raise your hand so everybody can hear your question. And please direct your question to one or all of our speakers. And so if you have a question or a comment, we'd love to hear from you. Oh, very good.
Good afternoon, I'm John Torrey with the Nature Conservancy. Question for Dr. Lentz. Are there any states or regions that do coastal resiliency really well, particularly well, that you can think of or point to, parts of the country that we might look to for leadership?
I guess I would push back on you a little bit and ask you how you're defining resiliency, just for a moment, in terms of returning to a former state, or resiliency is a term that has a lot of different interpretations I've learned over the last few years. So if you could clarify that for me.
I was thinking in terms of, for example, coastal erosion and loss of coastal habitat. Are there places that are doing that in ways that are innovative, that have good regulatory approaches that we might consider?
It's hard to name. I guess I would say it's hard to name any one in particular, because there's so many different flavors and there's so many different levels of people operating in different ways. And because our landscape is so variable, there are different systems that are facing different levels of erosion and loss. So I think the Gulf, in a lot of ways, because the loss is so rapid down there, simply because the subsidence rates coupled with the sea level rise increases, et cetera, they're really being pressed to address these challenges, both from a restoration standpoint as well as from a social standpoint as well. They're kind of at the nexus in considering both. And that's something that's come up a lot in some of our national climate assessment conversations as we're working, because it's just an area where in many ways people are being forced to act. And so, that's something that jumps to mind. Others certainly, different experiences and flavors. Our national park system is experiencing all kinds of different levels of challenge in terms of allowing the system to naturally respond as it will in processes to proceed, and at the same time, for example, in the case of Fire Island, we've got communities living on the island that are facing significant loss, and so there are these tensions there and creative solutions that need to continue to be explored and pressed. So it's not a very specific answer to your question, but those are some of the things that jump to mind. What?
I heard you say golf.
I did say the golf, and I'm not sure if anybody else on the panel has anything to add to that, because
It's encouraging to see states proactively planning, like in the base camp here in Rhode Island, thinking ahead for these versus being reactive seems very important. So to the extent that states are doing that, that's critical.
Jackie, we have a question up front.
Hey guys. So I have a question. Thinking about the numbers you put up for sea level rise, it seems like a really difficult management question to say, and I'm forgetting, I think it was 2.5 to 4 is most likely and 7 is a worst case. So you might have a really creative solution, but it can only make it to 4.5. So how do you know, to hit 7? And one of the problems is that we're having a really hard time constraining globally what sea level rise is going to look like. It's mostly from thermal expansion. We don't know the heat content change of the deep ocean. The problem is, a lot of the area of the deep ocean is in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So it doesn't make it into the national climate assessment. So how do it's a local issue, because it's going to be sea level rise in Rhode Island, but it's something happening offshore and we don't know enough about it, and it's costing local dollars to not be able to constrain the model to know the appropriate solution. So what's this discussion looking like these days? Oh, I'm sorry, that was a softball.
I wish I had a better answer for you on that. I think scientists in many ways are very comfortable with uncertainty, but almost too comfortable with uncertainty, and then it gets to this very blurry problem, right, of, now nothing's specific, and what do we do with that, and how far out do we build our cones of uncertainty or otherwise, around this, and then is that meaningful, or does that spark any action, or anything specific that people can then use and bring into their approaches. So, I wish I could say something more specific to you on that question. I think it's something that it's a complex problem. I don't know the answer. I'm going to put it that way, and I'd be curious. I'm going to push back on you and ask about your experience with this and what thoughts you have in terms of your frustrations and how some of that communication might better happen.
Yeah, well, I just think it's such an interesting query to be like, this is a global scale issue, but we're having to put a lot of times local dollars onto it, but we could save local money on the management of it if we invested in being able to sample some of these key gap areas that occur at an international level. And I don't know the answer to this, it's just, I was wondering if people are talking at that level.
Not in the conversations I've been part of anyway. So, and it's a great point to raise because now it's on my radar screen moving forward.
Yes.
So I could tell you that.
Question over here, Jackie.
Thanks very much. So first, two things. One, shout out to uncertainty. Second, for Leslie, Deep Argo has been going for a couple of years now, so we're getting much deeper measurements of ocean hydrography for estimating deep ocean content, heat content, contributions to sea level rise, so that's progress in that direction. I had a question for Dr. Lentz after her talk, but I realized it was really a question for all three of the speakers. Where do observations come in here? As you all are co-producing these solutions for very different problems, and as you're all running very complicated systems models, do you have the data you need to inform those decisions and to test those really complicated models? And if you don't, what are those data you need? Can you get them? What does the future of that look like?
Yeah, you need a break, don't you?
Well, no, it's fine.
I didn't put up, I took out a slide for time about the use of the remote sensing that our team's been doing. I think where we are at the moment is we might have the spatial coverage that we need. We need more ground truthing to really get the learning algorithms to really identify, and frankly, we need to identify what are we calling for instance, like a healthy state system or a stress state system. So these models can tell us it's green. I see green, and those are leaves, and so therefore I'm going to classify that as a healthy system. And I think what we're trying to figure out is what are the other parameters that we can measure on the ground that hopefully one day might be able to get scaled up so that it won't be as resource intensive that we'd have to bring in an entire team to do sampling, especially in remote areas. Yeah.
I can speak to this a little bit.
Yeah, please.
I presented a range of things in my talk, and so the answer to your question on the observation, empirical, and data question varies across all of those. There are enough data to parameterize those types of simulation models, but more is always better. Validation can be a challenge there, and unfortunately, in some cases, you have to use values maybe derived elsewhere in systems that aren't ideal or exactly the ones you're using or investigating. It's been heartening to see the efforts to collate lots of this data. I mentioned the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program's efforts on the State of the Watershed report. In the ocean planning space, the Northeast Regional Ocean Council and their data portal and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Ocean Council and their data portal have really, over the last decade, advanced our ability to do integrated ocean management, or at least investigate it if we're not going to do it. West Coast is now advancing on that too. And so those efforts are critical. And the thing I was trying to demonstrate here is a shortcoming I see in a lot of that is the linking to valued end uses and measuring the intensity of those uses and how people's preferences are going to be impacted by decisions. So trying to get more of that information in is not trivial, but is the goal, for me at least.
Okay, I had a minute to get my thoughts together. Thank you. So I will echo a bit of what Britta and Rob have said, in that, especially at least on the coastal impact side of things, I think we have a lot of shoreline change data. What we don't have is a lot of landscape change data. And we're getting caught up, right? We have a lot of satellite data and remote sensing data, but as Britta said, tracking that and really detecting what change matters, what indicates actually at those, what can we say in terms of the change that we're observing, and is it indicative of a tipping point or some sort of threshold crossing that we need to be paying attention to. So that's the piece that we really need to brush up and beef up, in my opinion, because that allows us to validate some of these models where we are making some projections with the high uncertainty. And so that's the piece that I would really like to bring in the next few years, particularly. So.
I have a question, I guess, for all three of you, but maybe Dr. Griffin knows a little bit more in terms of the economics. So I work with industrial man-made contaminants in coastal systems. And what I did before that was more along the lines of what you all do, coastal biogeochemistry. And what I'm kind of moving towards in my own research is those things really go hand in hand, looking at how you can add value to things like living shorelines, because they actually will probably remove a lot of industrial contaminants, specifically PFAS, what I study. So are people factoring that in at all? Because USGS, for example, cares a lot about polar organic contaminants like PFAS. And I think people who care about money also would care a lot about that. So is that something that's creeping into your world at all? Other ecosystem services drawing down contaminants that are I really think that's how you're gonna make living shorelines easier to sell to a government.
Start with that. The water quality model that I presented, I didn't mention this, but it was a 6 pollutant index that included a wide array of different potential contaminants. Not that one, unfortunately. I think that's partly due to catching up to the reality of that situation. But it certainly could be included in there. It really depends partially on, to get to a valued outcome, what are the potential valued changes that arise from having that in there? Is it the kind of thing that you wouldn't want to swim in? You certainly seem like you wouldn't want to drink it for health reasons, and so it could be incorporated along the same lines that I just mentioned, and certainly has been explored already. I know there are EPA staff here in the audience that could maybe speak more to what they think the priority is for that relative to some of these other pollutants.
I'll put on my Sea Grant hat and say that living shorelines is a big interest in South Carolina. And value added through a service like that has not come up yet. I think it's more really for where we are in the low country, it's focused on flood control and growth of oysters just for general water quality, but putting it in an economic term, I think would be very useful. I think that one of the major hindrances in every living shoreline project is to make sure that the permitting is in place, and that seems to be, I think, one of the biggest barriers.
It's certainly a conversation that I'm having in the interagency space a lot. Again, not necessarily tied to this specific issue, but more of the nature-based solutions options and all of the different flavors and how far that has come in the last few years, and certainly since the last climate assessment. So yeah, that's what I can say there.
Like, are there certain types of living shorelines that are better at containing these contaminants?
It's partially just like a theory I've developed, but partially also supported by literature that like the ones that focus on using core log designs
Yeah.
that retain sediment can potentially be a major source. So I used to work on a living shoreline that was a wastewater treatment outfall where they were only concerned about nitrogen and phosphorus, but essentially by putting this there instead of just a pipe, like a pipe out, you were drawing a lot of contaminants down into one specific section of the river and slowing their ability to spread instead of like a fire hose. So that was something that I had stopped working on because I came here, and I look forward to finishing one day. But like those kind of designs are potentially based on all the carbon sink research out there, really promising. So if somebody wants to hire me.
Good proposal.
And this will be our final question.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. Thank you all for excellent presentations. You did a really nice job talking about the value of science and working with people to help make informed decisions. I'm curious, or maybe concerned about our little sort of limited options in terms of interventions, as well as the costs associated with those, as well as to what degree we're evaluating their effectiveness. And I want to be hopeful here, though. Do you have any nice examples of interventions that you think have helped made our communities stronger or more resilient?
So I talked about, briefly alluded to the Clean Air Act, for example. There was some concerns on the dimensions you mentioned about the Clean Water Act, but the Clean Air Act is something that every year pays for itself multiple times over in terms of reduced mortality associated with airborne pollution. And so, scientists maybe tend to focus on where the problems are and not so much the things that have already been mostly addressed. And so that to me is a great example of the efficacy of these sorts of policies to affect change.
Yeah, and I would just echo that, I think it shakes out in the policy realm and the policy space. And I have a colleague that's done a lot of work with trying to really build those relationships and build, make sure that the science is actually reaching the policymakers so that the policies can be that much more informed and hopeful. This is a lot of work in California right now, but I can offer that.
Yeah. I was thinking about these inflection points in the system, right? So we've got this system right now of coastal management. And so one inflection point or like kind of new change to it is the involvement of private, either private resources, private landowners, or private companies that are interested in getting involved. And I think that might actually start really getting the ball rolling. So one of my tasks at Sea Grant in that partnership part of my title is to start working on what are public-private partnerships going to look like for the state. Is it going to be something like carbon crediting, or are there going to be other ways of or resilience crediting is coming out with the Nature Conservancy's role. And so, so are these moments where we can start building these partnerships to bring these new inflection points that we hadn't worked on before?
Let me make a closing comment here, and that's one to thank all three of our IGERT alumni who have brought three different very interesting perspectives to the table. Dr. Lentz, thank you for sharing your work in making USGS research relevant to local communities. And she didn't say it and probably can't say it, but imagine the challenge she has of doing this with such radical changes in direction with every change of administration and budget. So you have your work cut out for you.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. Dr. Jessen, thank you so much. And if you have time afterwards, pick her brain about the complex social and cultural communities that she has to deal with in the lowlands of South Carolina. She has her work cut out for us. And Dr. Griffin, we know the science models are complex enough. When you add your social and economic variables, you're going to be working hard for a long time. So all of you, thank you very much for your presentation.
Peter, not so fast. I need you to stand right over there. I just want to say a couple words here really quickly. I'm going to be leaving the directorship of the Coastal Institute this June, and as this is my last formal opportunity to grab the mic, I'm taking it. The mission of the Coastal Institute, as many of you may know, is to advance knowledge, develop solutions to environmental problems in coastal ecosystems. There are 5 people who have served the mission in exceptional ways. And one of them, of course, is to my right. So I want you, if you would, to step forward to accept an award as a symbol of your place as a University of Rhode Island Coastal Institute Distinguished Senior Fellow. I am not going to go through an enormous amount about what Pete has accomplished as a professor emeritus of the College of the Environment and Life Sciences, but I want to say something about his work for the Coastal Institute. He's now leading the climate response demonstration site at Napatree Point in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, which is focused on stewardship of a natural area ecosystem, sharing research findings with other such systems in the interest of preservation of such sites. He's also served the CI as an associate director of the CI advisory group. I also want to bring forward Dr. Candace Ovia, who quite frankly seems to collect awards just as a pastime. She is a professor emerita, as you all know, of GSO. Again, I'm not going to speak about her many things that she has accomplished over the years, but I will say that she has served the CI as a succinct font of wisdom, a member of the CI advisory group, and as an inspiration to women in science, and quietly acknowledged horse whisperer. You know, for each of them, the wave in this you may think is simply a wave. No, for Pete, it's a flood of acronyms. For Candace, it's actually a rush of nitrogen bubbling up. But in this particular instance, I congratulate you for also being a distinguished senior fellow of the Coastal Institute. And And in addition to that, there are 3 other people who could not be with us today, but I'm hoping they're leaning into our virtual session, one of whom is Dr. Charles Roman, who has been a retired National Park Service research coordinator, and he serves as an adjunct professor with both GSO and CELS and has for many years. He's also been an extraordinary contributor to the Coastal Institute. And the very report that you referenced, Rob, that was done with the Coastal Institute in support of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, the state of Narragansett Bay and its watershed, is something that Charlie was a very significant editor on, and part of the work that he's done in his role as an associate director of the Coastal Institute advisory group. His wave is the flow of data, which thrills him no end. We also have another person who is very important to us, and that's Dr. John King. Many of you know him as an emeritus professor of the Graduate School of Oceanography. Again, in his situation, I went to John when the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program was going through some very difficult challenges to finish that very status and trends report that was referenced. And I said, John, I need you to serve as the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. And he very graciously agreed to do so and did a wonderful job. Candace also served on that committee as well. And it was a very important step in ensuring that that report was done, which means that the National Estuary Program distributed the funding to the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program and continued much of the very important research we all rely upon. In his case, the wave represents John warning you that he will not hold back on his opinions, which many of you may have experienced at one time or another. In addition to that, we also have, and Q, I'm going to have you come up here and take that for Art, if you would, Dr. Art Gold, who is in the, soon to be a professor emeritus of the College of the Environment and Life Sciences. Art is working with us currently at the Coastal Institute on the Roger Williams Park Climate Response Demonstration Site. And you may say, well, what does Roger Williams Park have to do with a climate demonstration site for Coastal Institute? And the answer is this, that this is in response to the inflow of contaminated fresh water from multiple ponds and rivers that surround the park from different municipalities and the outflow to the Patuxent River. They're working very hard on cleaning that up and cleaning up the water quality there, which will, of course, will inform processes like that for other such locations that are important to many people. In the particular case of Roger Williams Park, it is very important as a coastal metaphor for the children of thousands of diverse freedmen descendants to newly arrived and first-generation families for whom it's freedom from an urban heat island. And Roger Williams Park is an extraordinary opportunity for us to do things that are not just talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but actually living the experience. And Dr. Gold is working on that right now, which we're very pleased to have him do. And for that, he is also becoming a distinguished senior fellow of the Coastal Institute. So we have all those folks, and we will make sure they get their, make sure that they also get their awards. And I should have added that Dr. Gold's wave represents a rush of spring water bubbling up in Michigan woods. Back when I was writing the Coastal Cabaret and songs about, well, coastal issues, I remember talking with him because one of my favorite things was always to interview scientists and say, what made you care about this? What turned you into a scientist? What was inspiring to you? And they always thought that the mic was off, so they allowed themselves to say something that carried some emotion, because scientists won't be emotional unless the mic's off. That's been my experience. And so he said, when I was a child growing up, and there I was in the Upper Peninsula, I used to go for walks in the woods, and all of a sudden I would see water appear out of the ground. And I would follow that water until it disappeared again. And I knew that was my life's work, which is pretty fabulous because it really is his life's work. Okay, thank you all so much to the IGRT students. It's fantastic to have you all back. Thank you all for being here today, those of you who are here virtually as well. And congratulations to our distinguished senior fellows. Thank you all.
You succeed.